Well, 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 it seems we are living through a tale of two censorious regimes. Both the United States and the Cuban government are working hard to censor what their citizens say on social media so that there is no narratives spreading on the internet which counter the narrative that the government is looking to push at any given time. The Cuban government decided to start censoring social media and pretty much lock people out from using social media sites this week because of the protest movement that started over the weekend on Sunday. They did not want all of that bad publicity for their regime getting out into the rest of the world. And this is understandable. It's a classic authoritarian tactic to try and censor dissidents and arrest people who go on, Spanish television. And by Spanish television, I don't mean Spanish language. I mean Spain. There was a TV channel in Spain that was interviewing this woman in Cuba, and she was arrested live on TV because she was guilty of wrongthink, and she was saying things during the interview that the government didn't like, so they went to her apartment and arrested her. But sadly, here in the U.S., our government has much the same attitude towards people who say the wrong things on the internet, and that is why the Biden administration is now working with social media sites to censor their critics. They are actively flagging posts from dissident users on Facebook and, I assume, other websites. And their argument is that these folks are a threat to national security. They are guilty of misinformation. And misinformation, of course, is it's a very, transparent word that basically means you are in disagreement with the regime, with the blob. Now, at this point, our government here in the United States has not gone as far as Cuba to send the police to people's homes and arrest them for what they say online, but they are doing as much, almost, as the Cuban regime to censor what people say online. The punishment in this country is just not as severe yet. We do see that in certain cases, our regime can be quite, strict and punitive in the way that it punishes dissidents. We see that with the folks who were involved with the incident on January the 6th, and the government has made it clear that they are trying to make examples out of those people. And why do you make an example out of someone? Well, it's supposed to be a very clear threat to anyone else who might be in a similar situation to those people to say, hey, don't be a dissident. Do not dissent against the government. Or else we will lock you up in solitary confinement without bail, and in many cases without even charges. And so the more I think about it, the more I realize that the government in Washington really does not have a lot of room to criticize the regime in Havana's approach to these protest movements. I don't think, obviously, that the government in Washington is nearly as offensive or egregious overall when compared to the government in Havana. But they are using a lot of the same tactics, and so it's difficult, if not impossible, for the White House and Washington in general to criticize the Cuban government in principle. And perhaps that's why, they were a little hesitant to condemn what the Cuban government is doing. Now, I believe it was either today or yesterday, Biden did have to come out and use more strong language because there's been a lot of pressure put on him, by the Cuban-American lobby. But overall, perhaps the folks in the White House, look at what's going on in Cuba and see, hey, they're just kicking people off of social media. Hey, they're just imprisoning political dissidents. That's not so bad. We do stuff like that. And, the parallels that can obviously be drawn are not or have not been enough for the Biden administration to say, hey, you know what? What the Cubans are doing kind of looks like what we're doing. Maybe we should cool off for a couple of weeks and not sound quite so authoritarian, lest we be compared to the Cuban regime. But they haven't slowed down at all. In fact, Psaki, the press secretary who represents the official opinion of the White House, is suggesting that the tech companies, which serve as U.S. government cutouts, who do the bidding of the United States in censoring critics of the regime, that they do not go far enough, because Psaki says, hey, why should we have to flag these people on all these different platforms and have them, and have people banned from Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all these other sites? It should just be that we have a master list, and when the government says, hey, you're a dissident, you need to be kicked off social media, you get yanked off of every platform simultaneously. When you say the wrong thing, whether it's about vaccines or Black Lives Matter or, I don't know, climate change or top marginal tax rates, whatever the issue is of the day, if you are deemed a threat to national security, well, then you need to be unpersoned. If you question the integrity of American elections, we already, unperson you. That's already something, in and of itself, which I would never do. I would never question the integrity of American elections, of course, because I want to stay on YouTube. But if you do, you can be certain that you will be removed and that your voice will be silenced, because it is a threat to national security to question the legitimacy of our elections, because then you are bringing into question the legitimacy of the regime itself. Now, this wasn't actually what I intended to talk about today. I wanted to talk about more of the issue of the internet specifically, but I think this has gone in an interesting direction, which is why I kind of like to do these things stream of conscious. I never use a script. I never plan these things out. I don't use notes. But I think now that I've gotten that point out of the way, I will move on to what I originally planned to discuss, which is this plan that I guess the first person who wasn't the first person who thought of it, but the first person to talk about it publicly was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, of trying to beam an internet connection into Cuba to restore people's access to social media, which seems quite interesting to me. I don't know how this is possible. DeSantis does not detail in his letter to Biden, which was publicly published. It was an open letter. He does not detail exactly how this would be done, but he says that the technology exists for us to beam the internet into Cuba and provide an uncensored internet connection. Because in Cuba, of course, it's a communist country. The infrastructure is all owned by the government. It's controlled by them. And so if they want to turn off internet access to certain websites and black it out, they can do that, which, by the way, the U.S. has that ability too. The FBI shuts down websites, that they don't like too. There are, like the Silk Roads, for example. And so it's not, it's not like this is a power that's unique to Cuba. Lots of countries, censor certain websites and they block access. Well, the U.S. is trying to make it possible for folks in Cuba to access websites so that they can try and transmit information on what's going on in Cuba right now, so that we have a better idea here in the United States. And generally speaking, I mean, this doesn't sound like a bad idea to me. This is a much sounder idea than what the mayor of Miami had, which is that we should bomb Cuba. That's not a good idea. The first video that I made about this situation in Cuba, the thumbnail said, "Do not invade," because that's the first instinct of a lot of these hawks. It's like, oh, there's something going on, let's invade. They're like, no, we don't need wars in Cuba. But trying to help them get around their own government censorship, that makes sense. But of course, it is very hypocritical, because we here in the United States need a foreign government to beam us in a free internet connection to where we can get around a lot of the censorship too. It is ironic that we're trying to help the Cuban people out with get around an issue of government authoritarianism that the United States is imposing upon its own people. Because remember, the reason why the Cuban government wants to keep people off of social media is because this whole, uprising is a threat to state security. These people would be regarded as insurrectionists by the Democratic Party if they were here in America. And despite the irony, Joe Biden has come out and said that he is considering trying to implement this idea that DeSantis put forward, which, again, I have mixed feelings about. It's, on the one hand, hey, I would like it if the folks in Cuba can get access to the internet and so that we can see what's going on there, and I hope that they're successful in overthrowing the government there. I don't want them to become an American puppet regime because, the the track record for U.S. puppet governments in Latin America is really, really bad. I can't really think of many cases where they end up free or prosperous. There are, some mixed cases, like I would say Chile was a mixed case. You had, Chile was not free, but there was a certain level of market liberalization which allowed Chile some, a decent level of prosperity. It was doing, for a while, it outperformed the rest of Latin America by a decent bit. But overall, I think that all of these countries, it would be much better off left to their own devices to rule themselves as they see fit. They might make mistakes, but the U.S. has not done a good job ruling them. So, they're just as capable as anyone at this point. So I hope that the Cuban communist regime falls, I don't want them to lose their independence from the United States, because the one thing that you can say about the Cuban communist regime that you can't take away from them is that they've at least remained independent from the United States, which, while they've been dependent on other countries, they were dependent on the Soviet Union for the entirety of the Cold War, and then they had a very shaky time in which they were sort of adrift at sea with no benefactor for quite a few years in the 90s. That was a shaky time, but Fidel Castro was still in power then, and so he was able to try and hold the people together and say, hey, remember me, you like me, I'm a cool guy, don't you want to remain loyal? And people said, okay, fine. And then in the 2000s, Venezuela was doing very well because the price of oil was sky high, and so Venezuela was able to support Uncle Fidel in Cuba. But then Venezuela went broke, and they can't support Cuba anymore, and so things are not going well there. And so I would like to see the Cubans be able to be independent and successful, independently wealthy. Because, like I said, they've always had to survive, with some kind of benefactor keeping them afloat. And the times, such as the 1990s, or the time, from present day, ever since Venezuela went broke, Cuba has not done very well. But again, at least they've been somewhat independent. So that's a really hard thing to achieve, and a lot of people, a lot of nations will choose poverty over dependency. But even if they're poor, they don't have to live under communist totalitarianism. A free Cuba may, for a time, still be a poor Cuba, but being poor and free is better than being poor and unfree. And I might say being poor and free, I would still, which again, it's easy for me to say from my cushy residence in Florida, I would rather be free and poor than unfree and, relatively wealthy. I won't say rich because, you never have a society where everyone's literally rich. So all in all, I'm skeptical of this whole beaming the internet into Cuba plan. I'm skeptical because I don't know if it's possible. I don't see how it's possible. Two, if it is possible, there's got to be some kind of catch to this. I don't know how, I don't know what the catch is, but there's probably going to be some kind of catch to it. But with that said, I'm still remaining hopeful and optimistic for the situation in Cuba. And, after growing up, here in Florida, knowing a lot of folks from Cuba, and knowing people who has family in Cuba, or people who've grown up here whose family came from Cuba, I would like to see this situation resolved. And frankly, I'd like to, see the place for myself under non-communist rule. So, with that said, I will continue monitoring this situation. Again, we're getting much slower trickle of information. I haven't found anywhere that's still putting out good information. I mean, there's got to be something coming out of Cuba, but the flow has really slowed to a trickle at this point. But I'm going to keep my eye on it, and I will follow the situation either until it sort of what's the term, fizzles out, or until we see a real change. And I will closely be watching, trying to monitor whether any any regime change in the country, whether it looks like it's a true organic changing of the guard and a fall of communism and a replacement with with some new independent government, or if it looks like the communist regime is just being replaced by a U.S. puppet regime, which, again, I want to add this caveat before I go. A U.S. puppet regime, while it is not what I'm hoping for, it's at least better than communism. I will say that. It's much, much better. If they... I don't think that a U.S. puppet regime in the year 2021 will look like Pinochet in Cuba or Batista. I don't think they're going to end up with Batista 2.0. I think it'll be somebody more clean-cut and less militaristic. But whoever it is, I think will be better than Miguel Diaz-Canal. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.